You can stop performing now. Imagine for a moment that you've been handed a single rule, just one rule, and you've been told it governs the most important evening of your entire life. The rule is this: if anyone in that room asks you to dance, anyone at all, and you say no, you cannot dance again for the rest of the night, not with anyone, not even if you change your mind later. One refusal, the whole evening gone, and the room will know it. Every person watching from the edge of the floor, every mother seated along the wall, every cluster of young men standing near the door, all of them will know exactly what happened, and exactly what it means for you. That is not a romantic interpretation of what a Regency ball was. That is the rule, written down, enforced, and perfectly understood by every young woman who stepped through those doors. Tonight, we're going inside that world. Not to admire the gowns and the candlelight, though both were genuinely extraordinary, but to understand what it actually felt like, from the inside, from the perspective of the young woman standing at the edge of the dance floor, holding her expression exactly right, while every decision she made carried the weight of her entire future. Let's begin. She is 16 years old, or possibly 17. The exact age is entirely up to her parents. There are no forms to fill in, no official threshold to cross, no ceremony of any particular formal significance. The decision is made privately, within the family, and announced simply by bringing her to the first ball of the season, in a new dress, and that is that. She is out. Out is the Regency shorthand for something that required no further explanation at the time. It meant she was now officially participating in adult social life. It meant she was available for courtship. It meant the marriage market had formally opened for her. One moment she was a girl in the drawing room. The next she was a young woman on the floor of a ballroom in London, and everyone in that room understood what her presence there signified. The transition happened without ceremony, and without any opportunity to prepare for it in the way you might prepare for something you could see coming. You might know, in an abstract sense, that the season was approaching. You might have been told in general terms what to expect, but there is a particular quality to the moment of actually being in the room, actually standing at the edge of the floor for the first time, in the new dress, with the candles overhead and the music beginning, and the eyes of the room moving toward you, that no amount of preparation quite captures. It arrives, and it is different from everything you imagined. The term sounds transactional, because the reality was transactional, though nobody used that word, and everyone involved went to considerable lengths to avoid thinking of it in those terms. The ball was called a ball. The season was called the season. A young woman was said to have come out, or to be appearing, or simply to be out, as though she had simply emerged from somewhere into the light, which, in a sense, she had. From the private domestic world of girlhood, from schoolrooms and morning lessons and the quiet company of family, into the very public world of the ton. The word ton comes from the French word for tone, meaning the particular quality of manner set by those at the very top of society. It was the collective name for the upper reaches of Regency England, not just the aristocracy, though they were certainly included, also the gentry. Families with land, or titles, or money, or connections, or ideally all four at once. During the London season, which ran more or less from January through to June, all of these families converged on the capital at the same time. They moved into townhouses in Mayfair and Grosvenor Square and Berkeley Street. They opened accounts with fashionable tradespeople, engaged additional servants, and began the elaborate social machinery that would define the months ahead. There was a particular kind of energy to London during the season that people who lived in the city the rest of the year described with some feeling. The streets became busier. The shops along Bond and Oxford Street stayed crowded through the afternoon hours. The same faces appeared everywhere, at the opera, at Almack's on Wednesdays, at private balls on Thursdays and Fridays, at morning concerts and afternoon exhibitions and the various other events that filled the calendar of the ton. It was a world, and it had a texture, and a young woman making her first appearance in it was doing so in full public view of everyone her family knew. The season existed, at its most fundamental level, to facilitate marriages. Not love, or not primarily love. Love was considered a welcome outcome if it happened to occur. What the season was actually built for was the efficient identification of suitable matches between families of appropriate social standing. A young man needed a wife with the right connections and a decent portion. A young woman needed a husband with an income that could support a household. Both sides needed to evaluate the other under socially controlled conditions, in settings where wealth, character, breeding, manners, and appearance could all be assessed at once. And your role in these assessments, whether you were the one assessing or the one being assessed, depended entirely on which side of the floor you were standing on. It was, if you want to be precise about it, a market, a marriage market. And the balls were the trading floor. Here's the thing. This is the part that genuinely surprises people who know the Regency primarily through its most romantic representations. In those versions, the sweeping television adaptations, the novels that foreground the romance over the social mechanics, the ball is glamour. Gowns and music and glances exchanged across candlelit rooms, and it was all of those things. It genuinely was. But underneath the glamour, running through every interaction and every dance, was a system so specific and so consequential that many young women found the whole experience genuinely terrifying. Not the exciting kind of terrifying, the kind that lives in the stomach and doesn't fully leave until you're safely home again. The reason, when you looked at it directly, was simple. A young woman of the gentry in the Regency era had, in practical terms, two possible futures. She could marry well, or she could not. If she married well, meaning a man of sufficient income and appropriate social standing, her material future was secured. She would have a household to manage, a position in society, a degree of financial stability she could not otherwise acquire on her own. The house would be hers to run. The social calendar would be hers to set. The children would be hers to raise. And within the considerable constraints of married life in the early 19th century, she would have something that unmarried women almost never had. A domain that was, by social convention, actually hers. If she married badly, she would have a considerably harder version of that same life, probably without a partner she could tolerate, and with the added difficulty of fewer resources to manage. The house would still be hers to run, but the running would be harder. The position in society would be lower, and if the husband turned out to be genuinely unpleasant, which the limited opportunities for courtship in this system made disturbingly possible, there was essentially no recourse. You had made your choice in those 20 minutes on the dance floor, and the choice was permanent. And if she did not marry at all, if season followed season without a serious offer, if the years accumulated and the invitations gradually began to come less frequently, she became what people called, without particular cruelty but with a resigned precision, a spinster, a dependent, a woman who would spend the rest of her life in someone else's house, usually a brother's or a married sister's, occupying a room that was never quite fully hers, and a position that required permanent, graceful invisibility. There were no other acceptable options, not for a woman of her class. She could not enter trade, she could not take lodgings of her own, she could not, in any practical sense, earn enough money to support herself independently. No profession was open to her. No property was hers to manage in her own name without a husband's authority. Her entire material future depended on the success of her marriage prospects, and those prospects were pursued primarily through the season, and specifically through the balls that formed its social centre, which means the ball was not, at its core, a party. It was a test, a live, public, highly observed test, conducted in front of everyone her family knew. The kind of test where the grading criteria are never written down, where the examiners are also competitors, and where the results are communicated not through any formal mechanism, but through the slow, inexorable process of who receives whose invitation next, and who is still not engaged by the third season, and whose name is no longer mentioned when the eligible young men are discussed. And if you were the person being tested, rather than one of the people doing the examining, you felt that difference in a way that was entirely physical. Think about that. 16 years old, walking into a room full of people who are all, in their various ways, evaluating you. Not just assessing your dress or your dancing, but your prospects, your family's standing, your manner, your suitability as a future daughter-in-law. All of it simultaneously while you attempted to look as though none of this was happening. Now consider what it cost just to be in that room. Consider what your family had already spent simply to put you there. Participating in a London season was not cheap. A family being genuinely careful, cutting corners where they reasonably could, foregoing some of the more extravagant entertainments, might spend around £900 for a single season. £900 in a world where many gentry families lived on annual incomes of somewhere between £500 and £2,000. A family who wanted to do it properly, to maintain the kind of social presence that actually improved their daughter's chances, could spend far more. The upper estimates for a fashionable season, attended at the right venues and in the right company, run as high as £40,000. £40,000. In a world where £1,500 a year was considered a comfortable household income. Let those numbers sit beside each other for a moment. One season, up to £40,000, a family income of perhaps £1,500 a year. This was not a discretionary purchase. For many families it was a gamble, a substantial, sometimes debt-financed bet on a daughter's chances in a market that might or might not reward her. If she secured a good match, the investment was vindicated. The debt became manageable. The season had done what seasons were supposed to do. If she didn't, if the season ended without a serious offer, the family had spent money they couldn't fully spare, and she would have to try again, next year, with less money remaining, 1 year older, and the same room full of the same people, watching with fresh attention to see whether anything had changed. The wardrobe alone was a significant line in the budget. A young woman entering the season required a complete new set of clothing, not just ball gowns, but morning dresses, walking dresses, afternoon dresses, carriage clothes and dinner gowns. Each occasion demanded a different outfit. Each outfit was expected to be new. Second-hand clothing, or anything too obviously refashioned from a previous season, signalled the kind of financial constraint that the ton noticed and remembered in the particular quiet way it remembered everything inconvenient. A ball gown from a proper London modiste, a skilled dressmaker working in a fashionable establishment, cost between £10 and £20. A court gown required for the formal ritual of being presented to the Queen at St James's Palace could cost anywhere from £100 to well over £500. £500 for a single dress. worn precisely once. The fabrics chosen for ball gowns were extraordinary. Fine muslin, silk, lightweight cotton, all chosen for how they moved in candlelight, how they behaved on a dance floor, how they conveyed the particular quality of youth and ease that fashionable society demanded. The right fabric in the right light with the right movement was a form of argument. It said, "I belong here. I am what I appear to be. I have been invested in, and the investment was worth making." Picture putting on a new ball gown for the first time in the hours before your first proper ball. Running your hands across the fabric, the weight of it, or the startling lightness in the case of the finest muslin, almost nothing in your hands, almost air. The sound it made when you moved, the way it settled when you stood still. There was probably, somewhere in the middle of all the anxiety, a genuine and private pleasure in the dress itself. It didn't last long, because your mother was there. Your mother had been planning this season, quietly, systematically, sometimes with an intensity that she would not have described in those terms, for months, possibly years. She'd written letters and secured introductions. She'd reviewed the guest lists for the balls you would be attending. She had identified which families were most worth engaging, which young men were most eligible, which reputations were solid and which were not, and which rooms offered the best position for you to be seen by the people who mattered. She had mapped the social landscape of the ton the way a general maps terrain before a campaign. She knew its contours, its advantages, its specific dangers. And she had been preparing you for this season not merely with dress fittings and dancing lessons, though there had been plenty of both, but with the accumulated intelligence of her own experience navigating the same world a generation earlier. She knew its rules with the intimacy of someone who had lived by them for years. She knew which social missteps could be recovered from and which could not. She knew which moments of apparent failure were merely temporary setbacks, and which were the kind that followed a young woman through subsequent seasons like a persistent quiet shadow. And she was bringing all of that knowledge to bear on your season, because she loved you, and because she understood the stakes better than you did. The pressure of that love was real. Loving pressure, certainly, but pressure nonetheless. And you felt it, even if you could not name it, even if everything between you and your mother was entirely warm, entirely well-intentioned, entirely full of genuine care. What failure meant in its most concrete form was not always catastrophe. It could simply be continuing. Another season, another set of balls, another wardrobe, another gamble. But the cumulative weight of the continuation was its own specific burden. Each year that passed added 1 year of age to a system that valued youth, 1 year of expense to a family that might be struggling, and 1 year of distance from the cohort of young women who had come out at the same time and were now, most of them, married and gone. There is something genuinely moving about the mothers in this story. Not sentimental, not simple, but a more complicated kind of moving. What the chaperone system was asking of your mother was not merely vigilance. It was the complete professional investment of her time, her intelligence, her social capital, and her emotional energy in an enterprise that was entirely about someone else's future, entirely about you. She had already navigated this system herself. She had arrived at whatever outcome it had produced for her, and now she was doing it again, on your behalf, with no guarantee of a better result. That is a particular kind of devotion. It deserves to be acknowledged. The evening before the first ball, the candles were lit early in the London townhouse. The house had a quality of controlled anticipation. Not quite festival, not quite alarm. Your dress had been examined that afternoon, found correct, put away again. Tomorrow it would be needed. Tonight there was nothing to do but wait, and try not to think too carefully about what the waiting was for. The next evening in the carriage, You sat with your hands folded in your lap and watched the dark streets of London move past the window. Your mother sat opposite you. She was watching something beyond the glass, perhaps the route, perhaps the evening ahead, perhaps nothing at all, just the necessary internal silence of someone who has prepared as thoroughly as she possibly can and must now simply let things unfold. You were probably thinking about the floor, about the introductions you would need, about whether you would remember the rules in the moment when they actually applied, about whether the right people would ask you, and whether you would say the right things when they did, about what the right things even were, and how you were supposed to know them instinctively when the moment came, when no amount of preparation quite told you what to do when you were standing in the room itself, in the light of the candles, with people you had never met looking at you from across the floor. The carriage moved through the London night. Somewhere ahead of you, a door was opening. The light from inside was beginning to reach the street, and the sound of music was just becoming audible above the sound of the horses. "Hello, lovely people." Before we go any further, a brief pause. I read every comment on these videos, usually far too late at night than is sensible. If you're watching this from bed right now, or from the couch, leave me a comment telling me where you are and what time it is there. I genuinely want to know, and if this kind of history is your kind of thing, a subscribe means more than you might think. Now, let the room settle. We were talking about arrival. The first thing to understand about the Regency ballroom is that nothing could happen without a formal introduction. Nothing. A gentleman could not approach a young woman and speak to her if they had not been formally introduced by a mutual acquaintance, by the host and hostess of the evening, or, at public balls, by the master of ceremonies, whose specific role included exactly this kind of social facilitation. A man might admire a woman from across the room for an entire evening. He might find her interesting, intelligent, beautiful, all of the above, and he could not say a single word to her without that introduction first. This seems, to a modern eye, almost comically rigid. A whole social system that requires a third party simply to permit two people to acknowledge each other's existence. A formality so complete that even noticing someone was in a sense regulated. But follow the logic and it makes particular kind of sense. In the Regency world, a person was vouched for by the people who introduced them. To know someone, to formally acknowledge them in your social circle, was a form of endorsement. It meant that someone whose word you trusted had, implicitly, extended their reputation to cover you. They had said in effect, "This person belongs here. This person can be trusted. This person is worth your time." Without that endorsement, a stranger was simply that, a stranger. And in a world with limited means of verifying anyone's character, finances, family connections, or intentions, strangers were inherently uncertain. The introduction was not mere bureaucracy. It was structural protection, imperfect certainly, but real. Once introduced, a gentleman could ask a young woman to dance, and here is where the first of the genuinely interesting rules comes into sharp view. If she accepted a dance, she was accepting those specific dances, and nothing more. Not friendship, not courtship, not any particular implication beyond the agreed-upon dancing itself. But how many sets she danced with the same man was being watched, carefully, by everyone in the room, simultaneously, without appearing to watch at all. 2 sets with the same gentleman in one evening was the line. 2 sets, meaning 2 individual country dances, each lasting perhaps 20 to 30 minutes, was perfectly acceptable. This was normal. This was just being pleasant to someone you had been introduced to. It showed good social manners and nothing more. 3 sets or more with the same man was something else entirely. 3 sets signalled serious, deliberate interest. In a world where unmarried men and women had almost no private time together, almost no unsupervised conversations, almost no legitimate channel for indicating romantic interest outside the carefully choreographed space of the ballroom, the number of times you danced with someone was a form of communication that everyone present could read. And 3 sets, or more, was understood by the dancers themselves and by everyone watching as something approaching a declaration. In some social circles, 3 sets with the same man was treated as nearly equivalent to announcing a formal courtship. In certain households, it was understood as tantamount to an engagement. You dance with someone 3 times in public, and people started assuming the matter was settled, which is an enormous amount of social weight to put on a simple question. Would you like to dance? But this rule, about the number of sets, is only the second most consequential rule of the Regency ballroom. The first, and the one that young women felt most acutely in their bodies whenever they entered a crowded room, was the refusal rule. If you refused a gentleman's invitation to dance, you could not accept anyone else's for the rest of the evening. Full stop. The logic is surprisingly coherent once you understand the system from inside it. In the Regency social code, refusing a dance was a significant act. It was a public statement, made in front of witnesses, that you did not wish to interact with this particular person. And if, having made that statement, you then turned and immediately accepted a dance with someone else, you had not merely declined one invitation, you had told the room, and him, and everyone watching, that you found him specifically unworthy of your attention. That was not a neutral social action. It could damage his reputation. It could embarrass your host, who had presumably invited you both in good faith. It could start a grievance that spread through the social network of the ton for months. The Regency world ran on the careful management of face, and a public snub was one of the more efficient ways to damage it. So the rule existed to prevent exactly this. If you said no, you sat down. You stayed seated for the rest of the evening, unless you could produce a very convincing prior engagement, and those were limited, and everyone in the room generally knew which ones were genuine. Think now about what this actually meant for a young woman navigating a ball. She has arrived in a room full of men she may or may not know. Some are eligible and perfectly pleasant. Some are eligible and deeply unpleasant. Some are old, or married, or otherwise unsuitable in ways that she is not permitted to articulate publicly. Some are pressing their invitations on her in a way that she finds uncomfortable, and she has exactly one option for declining, legitimately, without social consequence. Sacrifice the rest of her evening. No dancing, no conversations on the floor, no chance to be seen in the most visible social space in the room. Just the chairs along the wall, and the watching eyes, and the long, slow passage of the remaining hours. If she declined one unpleasant man and sat down for the night, she'd protected herself from that one man, and removed herself from the marriage market for the rest of the ball. The mothers along the wall watched. The hostess noted it, and tomorrow morning, in the morning calls, it would be mentioned. Not with malice necessarily, but it would be mentioned because everything was mentioned. The refusal gamble was real. Every young woman who attended a Regency ball understood it at a level that was almost instinctive, because it had been explained to her by her mother, by an older sister who had been through the system first, by a friend who had sat in those chairs and felt the specific quality of an evening lost to a single decision. You always had the right to say no, but you always knew what it cost. there is one more rule of the dance floor that deserves particular attention, because it has been so thoroughly distorted by popular culture that most people carry a picture of the Regency ballroom that is simply wrong. Modern period dramas love to show young women with small booklets at balls, dance cards dangling from their wrists on ribbons, with each dance pre-listed and names written neatly beside the corresponding dances. The whole evening organised in advance, everything scheduled, no surprises. This did not happen in the Regency era. Dance card became common later, in the Victorian era, spreading through the 1840s and 1850s. In the Regency, there were no dance cards, there was no booklet, there was no schedule written anywhere. Women did not write anything down. A young woman agreed to dance with a man, and she held that commitment in her memory. That was it. No record, no reminder, no receipt. If a second man later asked her for a dance she'd already promised, she had to tell him so from memory alone, and trust that he believed her. If she became confused about what she had promised to whom, or tried to claim a prior engagement she hadn't actually made, that was a social error, the kind that people noticed and discussed. Everything in the Regency ballroom rested on memory, nerve, and an honour system with absolutely no paper trail. The dances themselves were long and physically demanding. Country dances, the primary form of the Regency ballroom, were performed in long lines of couples, moving through complex sequences of steps and figures that required both technical skill and a particular kind of ease, making the difficult look effortless. A set of country dances could last anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes. It required practiced knowledge, not just of the steps, but of how to execute them with apparent unconcern while thinking about something else entirely. And while you were performing all of this, you were also expected to be having a conversation. This is the part that tends to get overlooked. The dance floor was, in the Regency world, the primary legitimate space where an unmarried woman and an unmarried man could speak to each other with anything approaching relative privacy. The music and the movement and the layered noise of a crowded room created a kind of acoustic shelter. Conversations could happen on the floor that the chaperones seated along the wall couldn't quite fully hear. Not entirely private. Nothing was ever entirely private, but private enough. Which meant that a country dance, 20 to 30 minutes of prescribed public movement, was the closest thing to a private conversation that most Regency couples would have before the question of engagement was formally being considered. 20 to 30 minutes. To make an impression that might shape the rest of your life. Think about what that actually meant. You've been introduced, you're dancing. The man beside you, this person you've perhaps met twice before and never spoken to for more than 2 minutes, is potentially, depending on how this evening goes, going to be part of every day of the rest of your life. You have this window, the music is playing, half a room of people are watching, even if they're pretending not to. And you must be charming but not too eager, clever but careful, warm but composed, interested but reserved. And you must also get the steps right. At public balls, those held in assembly rooms rather than private houses, there was an additional figure whose job was to manage the social traffic of the dance floor, the Master of Ceremonies. He made introductions. He ensured that women without partners were provided with them. He maintained the general order and propriety of the room. This sounds helpful, and it sometimes was. But the Master of Ceremonies also performed a function that was, for the women he was ostensibly helping, slightly double-edged. by visibly directing men toward unpartnered women, by making it publicly his business to ensure that no woman sat out, he simultaneously made visible the fact that certain women needed his assistance. He drew attention to the unpartnered state at the very moment he was solving it. The solution to the problem was also a form of the problem. What was a young woman being evaluated on while she danced, beyond the steps themselves? More than you might expect. Grace was part of it. The ability to move through the figures of a country dance without apparent effort, without stumbling, without losing the particular quality of composed ease that the ballroom demanded. But also deportment, how she held herself, how she carried her head, whether she looked comfortable or strained, whether her expression suggested she was genuinely enjoying herself or merely enduring. And then, crucially, conversation. Wit deployed carefully. A degree of intelligence that signalled she was interesting to talk to, without ever making the man she was talking to feel less intelligent than she was. This was its own specific skill, the performance of appropriate intelligence, enough to hold a conversation, not so much as to dominate one. And the calibration of this was expected to happen naturally, instinctively, without any visible calculation. The power asymmetry underlying all of this was total. Men asked, women waited, men decided when to approach and whom to approach. Women managed the invitations they received. And yet within this system, within the strict limits of who could initiate and who could only respond, the women who were good at this were not simply passive. They were strategic. They positioned themselves in certain parts of the room. They wore certain colours. They made certain gestures of openness that communicated in the visual language of the ballroom that they were willing to be approached. The men thought they were choosing. The women were often quietly directing who chose them. That is not a minor distinction. It is one of the more interesting things about the Regency ballroom if you look at it from a certain angle. The sensory world of the dance floor was insistent throughout all of this. The music played continuously from the beginning of the evening until well past midnight. The floor, waxed to a high, reflective shine, and then chalked with elaborate decorative patterns before the evening began, was warm underfoot from the bodies moving across it. The air smelled of beeswax candles and powder, and the particular close warmth of a room full of people dressed for occasion. When a country dance was in full swing, the room was genuinely loud. The music, the feet on polished wood, the murmur of 100 conversations happening simultaneously. And you moved through all of this carrying the awareness that the room was watching, even when the room appeared to be doing something else entirely. And in the middle of all of this noise and light and assessment, you were expected to be exactly right, to look like you were having a wonderful time while also making every decision with considerable care, to convey that this was just an evening, just dancing, while knowing perfectly well it was neither of those things. Not simple. The women who made it look effortless had practiced the effortlessness as carefully as they practiced anything else. The music played on, the dances turned. The chalked patterns on the floor were slowly, steadily worn away under the feet of the dancers, ground to dust by the very thing they had been created for. There was one building in Regency London that mattered more than any other to the marriage market. Not a palace, not a church, not any institution of government, law, or commerce. A set of assembly rooms on King Street in St. James's, Almack's. If you have never heard of Almack's, you are not alone. It's one of those pieces of Regency history that tends to be obscured by the more obviously romantic aspects of the period. But to the ton, in the years between roughly 1814 and 1835, Almack's assembly rooms were the single most important social venue in England. quite possibly in Europe, the entire gravitational centre of the season. Every Wednesday evening during the season, Almack's held a ball. Not the only ball of any given week. There were always other events, other assemblies, other competing invitations. But Almack's Wednesday nights were different in kind. They were the event around which everything else organised itself. To attend Almack's regularly throughout the season was to be at the very centre of the social world. To have applied for admission and been refused, to have been assessed and found wanting by the women who controlled the room, was a statement that followed you through the social season, and sometimes well beyond it. And here is where it gets genuinely interesting. You could not simply attend Almack's. You could not purchase a ticket at the door. You could not rely on your family name, your income, your title, or your connections to any individual person to get you in. Entry required a voucher, and vouchers were issued by the Lady Patronesses. The Lady Patronesses were a small committee of aristocratic women, generally between 6 and 8 at any one time, who controlled access to Almack's with an authority so absolute that it reads, from 2 centuries later, as nearly fantastical. Among the patronesses during the Regency's peak years were women such as Lady Jersey, Lady Cowper, Lady Castlereagh, Lady Sefton, Princess Esterhazy, and the Countess of Leven. These women were not elected. They were not appointed by any official body. They held their position through a combination of social standing, personal authority, and the collective agreement of the ton that they were the ones whose judgment counted. And what they decided was essentially who mattered. To obtain a voucher to Almack's you applied, in writing or through someone who knew a patroness, or through the careful cultivation of a connection that might eventually produce an introduction. Your application was reviewed, not against any written criteria, not by any official committee, but by the patronesses themselves in their private deliberations, according to standards they never fully articulated and that could shift from season to season based on nothing that anyone could precisely identify from outside the room, which is, as gatekeeping goes, quite thorough. The process of review was extraordinary. Every Monday during the season the Lady Patronesses gathered around a table covered with red cloth. They reviewed the applications they had received that week. They used 3 baskets to sort them. One for those who would be accepted, one for those who would be rejected, and one for those held in consideration, meaning neither yes nor no, but suspended in social uncertainty while the deliberations continued. Held in consideration was in many ways the most uncomfortable position. You were not refused, but you were not accepted. You simply waited, while the most powerful women in the ton decided what they thought of you. This could take weeks, and during those weeks your season was proceeding without the Almack's voucher that might have significantly improved it. A voucher, when finally granted, was a small piece of heavy cardboard, roughly the size of a modern playing card. It entitled the holder to purchase a subscription to the Wednesday balls. Without it, entry was impossible, under any circumstances whatsoever. No exceptions, no appeals, no alternative routes. The patronesses enforced this with a consistency that left absolutely no room for ambiguity. There is a story, widely reported, documented in multiple memoir accounts of the period, though the sources themselves come with the usual scholarly caveats about memoirs written years after the fact, about the evening when Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, arrived at the doors of Almack's and was turned away. The Duke of Wellington, the man who had defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, one of the most celebrated military figures in European history. At the height of his fame in the years following 1815, quite probably the most famous living person in England. He arrived at 7 minutes past 11. Almack's closed at 11 o'clock. The rule was not ambiguous. Lady Jersey, Sarah Villiers, Countess of Jersey, one of the most powerful of the patronesses, nicknamed Queen Sarah, within the ton for the authority she exercised, was informed that the Duke was at the door. Her reported response, as it circulated through the ton in the days that followed, was entirely in character. She was apparently delighted that this was the occasion on which the rule was first enforced in this particular way, because now no one could complain about its application to less illustrious arrivals. She sent her compliments. She declined to admit him. The Duke of Wellington was not admitted. One of the wealthiest, most decorated, most socially powerful men in England stood on the steps of a building on King Street, St. James's, and was told no by a woman in a ball gown, exercising an authority that no law had given her and that no law could have protected. And there was nothing, in any practical or social sense, that he could do about it. The story spread through the ton almost immediately, with the particular velocity that interesting social information always achieved in that world, and it carried a message that everyone understood with precision. If the Duke of Wellington could be turned away from Almack's for arriving 7 minutes late, there was no one in England immune to the patroness's judgment. No title was sufficient protection, no fortune was sufficiently large, no military glory was relevant. The rules of Almack's applied to everyone absolutely without exception. There is also, in some accounts, a secondary detail to this story, a suggestion that the Duke may have arrived not only late but also incorrectly dressed. Men attending Almack's were required to wear knee breeches, not trousers, knee breeches. Trousers by this point in the Regency were perfectly fashionable in street dress, increasingly common among men of fashion. But at Almack's they remained forbidden. Boots similarly were forbidden. Almack's was an evening establishment. Boots were day wear. Any man who arrived in trousers or boots was turned away at the door with the same calm, absolute authority that had been applied to the hero of Waterloo, which meant that for a period of perhaps 20 years, one of the most socially exclusive venues in England contained a room full of the most powerful men in the country, all wearing the specific clothes they had been instructed to wear by a small group of women who held no official authority whatsoever, which is, as situations go, not entirely dignified for anyone. And yet, there it was, every Wednesday night during the season, without interruption. Once inside Almack's, assuming your voucher was in order and you'd arrive before the clock struck 11, the first thing you would notice was the dancing. The ballroom was large and well lit, with the usual hundreds of candles. Beeswax at Almack's as a deliberate point of institutional quality, and an orchestra. Country dances the same as everywhere else. The same rules of the floor applied. The same assessment machinery, in a room whose exclusivity made every observation slightly sharper. The second thing you would notice was the refreshments. Almack served terrible food, not accidentally terrible, not the result of a poor cook or a tight budget. Deliberately, consistently, almost philosophically terrible. Thin lemonade, weak tea, dry cake. That was it. No wines, no substantial food. Nothing that might encourage anyone to drink too much, behave poorly, or linger at the supper table when they should be on the floor being observed. The patronesses had made a deliberate choice, and it was a choice, a conscious institutional decision, to provide refreshments that no one particularly wanted, because the point of Almack's was not the food. The point was the room, being in it, being seen in it, the fact of the voucher itself. You were there because you belonged there, and everyone in the room knew it, and you knew that they knew it, and this mutual knowledge was what made the room worth being in. Almack's existed on the logic of exclusion. The thing that made it valuable was precisely that not everyone could have it. For a young woman entering her first season, a voucher to Almack's was one of the most consequential things her mother could secure for her, because without it, without that piece of cardboard the size of a playing card, she was not at the centre of the social world. She was outside it, looking in from a position that everyone could read. The patronesses were not remote figures who issued judgments and then disappeared. They were present, at the balls, on the floor, in the room. Their opinion of a young woman formed through observation, through social report, through the dense network of aristocratic intelligence that the ton maintained about itself. A young woman who caught the favourable attention of a patroness might find her season improving in ways she couldn't fully trace back to any specific cause. A young woman who failed to make a favourable impression might find doors quietly closing without quite understanding why. This was power, informal, unlegislated, exercised at a table covered with red cloth on Monday mornings and in a ballroom on Wednesday nights, over thin lemonade and dry cake, by women who had decided collectively that it would be so. The candles burned warm and steady in the ballroom on King Street, and the vouchers were small and cardboard and the size of a playing card, and somewhere along the wall the patronesses were watching, and the future of a young woman's season could turn on whether they noticed her, and what precisely they thought when they did. The preparations for a ball began hours before the carriage was ordered. On the most important evenings, the opening of the season, a presentation at court, a first appearance at Almack's, those preparations could absorb much of the entire day. It began with the hair. A fashionable Regency hairstyle took significant time to achieve, and was not something most women managed alone. A lady's maid with skill would work through the process. Curls and pins, sometimes false hair pieces added for volume, all arranged into a style that would hold through an evening of dancing, the heat of a crowded room, and the various compressions that a busy ballroom produced. A simple arrangement might take an hour, an elaborate one could take considerably longer, and it had to be right, because the hair would be examined, as everything else about a young woman's appearance would be examined, by everyone she encountered that evening. A hairstyle that had loosened early, or that looked effortful rather than natural, or that somehow failed to complement the dress it was paired with, was a small failure with larger implications. The whole effect had to cohere. Then came the dress, the underpinnings first, the stays or corset, fitted and laced carefully, shaping the silhouette the dress would then display. Then the chemise, fine and white, then the petticoats, and then the dress itself lifted carefully over the dressed hair, a delicate operation that required a second pair of hands, settled into place, fastened at the back, smoothed at the front. Each layer added to the deliberateness of the whole enterprise. You were not simply getting dressed, you were constructing a presentation, an argument, made in fabric and form and careful arrangement, about who you were and what you were worth. The gown was not decoration, it was evidence, and everyone in the room you were heading toward would read it as such, whether they thought of themselves as reading it or not. Young women making their first appearance in society almost universally wore white, or the palest possible versions of other colours, cream, ivory, the most delicate blush pink. This was not a strict rule, but it was a very strong convention. White signalled newness. It communicated in terms the room could read instantly. She is just beginning. She has not yet accumulated the failures that come with time in this world. She has arrived new, and in arriving new she is claiming, implicitly, the full attention the room extends to things that are new. White was also, it should be noted, extremely impractical. It showed every mark. It required considerable care throughout the evening, all of which was, in a sense, part of the point. Only a family with sufficient servants and sufficient resources could maintain a white dress through a full evening of dancing in a warm, crowded room. The impracticality was itself a signal. For those young women who were also being formally presented at court, which was the mark of the high social tier, the preparation included something additional, something that was, even at the time, acknowledged to be at least somewhat extreme. And if you want to understand the particular flavour of social obligation that the Regency placed on its women, the court presentation is a useful place to look. The court presentation gown was a problem. By the second decade of the 19th century, fashionable dress had settled firmly into what we now call the Empire silhouette, high-waisted, narrow, light fabric falling from just below the bust to the ankle, simple in its lines, graceful in its restraint, the very opposite of what had been fashionable in the previous century. The court of Queen Charlotte had not followed fashion. Court dress for women presenting to the Queen required a hooped skirt, wide, structured, the silhouette of the 1770s, built on a framework that made the hips dramatically wider than any current fashion demanded. In addition to the hoop, the gown required a substantial train, a long extension at the back of the skirt, and the young woman being presented was required to wear 3 ostrich feathers in her hair, attached to lappets, long lace streamers that hung from the headdress down past the shoulders. 3 ostrich feathers in the hair that had just taken 90 minutes to arrange. Picture this carefully because it deserves to be pictured. You are 17. Your hair has been dressed in the fashionable Regency style, correct and carefully constructed. Now 3 large feathers must be pinned into it, and lace streamers attached, and the whole arrangement, which is now considerably top-heavy and slightly unstable, must be held in place while you are helped into a dress that has not been fashionable for 30 years, and includes a hoop that makes navigating a standard doorway without turning sideways a genuine practical challenge. You must then stand in a receiving line, possibly for several hours in this outfit, in a room full of other women dressed identically, a sea of hoops and feathers and lace streamers, all waiting for their moment before the Queen. And at the end of all of this, when your moment finally comes, you must approach the Queen, perform a deep and sustained curtsy, the kind that requires controlled descent and a steady, unhurried ascent, and then back away from the royal presence, slowly, without turning around, without stumbling on your train, without losing your feathers or your composure, or the expression of serene ease that the occasion demanded. Backward, in a hoop, with 3 ostrich feathers in your hair. Women practiced this for days before their presentations. The back step rehearsed over and over in bedrooms and drawing rooms, their mothers or sisters watching from across the room, getting the train right, getting the curtsy right, getting the exit right, so that backing through a door in court dress looked like something a person might simply do, without difficulty, at any time. The dedication required to perform a routine task, moving backward through a room, with total apparent ease, after days of anxious rehearsal, for an audience of the entire court while wearing feathers and a hoop and lace streamers past your shoulders, is a particular kind of achievement. It deserves to be named as such. The carriage ride to the ball had its own specific quality of suspension. You had left the house, with its familiar privacy, its domestic spaces that were simply yours, and you had not yet arrived at the destination. You were between, in your prepared form, neither private nor public, in the dark, in the expensive dress, moving through streets that were largely asleep. At the right hour on the right evening, however, those streets were anything but empty. The fashionable neighbourhoods of London during the season filled up with carriages doing exactly what yours was doing. Families moving from their townhouses to their various destinations, all dressed for occasion. It was possible, in Mayfair or near Grosvenor Square, to find yourself in a genuine traffic jam of carriages, all of them full of women in ball gowns, all of them waiting in the dark for the street to clear. The most glamorous traffic jam imaginable, and also one of the most anxious. Your mother sat opposite you in the carriage. She was almost certainly thinking about the room ahead. Who would be there? What needed to happen? Whether there was any final piece of strategic information she should share with you before you arrived, or she might simply be quiet. Mothers of daughters in the season became skilled readers of their children's pre-ball states. When to talk, and when simply to be present, was its own tactical decision. You were probably thinking about the floor. The carriage came to a stop, the door opened. You stepped out onto a pavement lit from above by the windows of the house. Ahead of you, looked up at a building containing the evening, and heard the music faintly from somewhere inside. In private townhouses, the ballroom was typically on the first floor, up a staircase from the entrance hall. Arriving guests climbed this staircase in their ball gowns and best attire, while the host and hostess stood at the top to receive them. It was theatrical by any standard. You were lit from below by the candles on the landing, observed from above before you had fully arrived, and your entire appearance was available for inspection by everyone already in the room before you had said a word to anyone. Every eye in the room had, in one way or another, already seen you. 15 seconds on the stairs, and everyone in the room at the top of them was, in their various ways, watching. The ballroom itself, when you reached it, was a simultaneous assault on every sense. The light, first. Hundreds of candles in great chandeliers, in wall brackets, reflected in the large mirrors that had been hung specifically to amplify the effect. The light was golden, warm, gently wavering, and it transformed the room into something that electricity has never quite replicated. It was genuinely extraordinary. The mirrors multiplied everything. The flames, the gowns, the people, the whole golden warmth of the room, until the space felt both intimate and enormous simultaneously. But beautiful as it was also hot. Ballrooms were famous for their heat. Hundreds of candles generated substantial warmth. The bodies of dozens or hundreds of dancing guests generated considerably more. Women managed this continuously with fans. The Regency fan was not a decorative accessory. It was a functional necessity, required for basic physical comfort in a crowded ballroom at full attendance. Period accounts describe the heat of these rooms in terms ranging from merely uncomfortable to genuinely oppressive, breathless, close, the particular difficulty of fine muslin in a hot room after an hour of dancing. Your dress, so carefully chosen and so carefully maintained, was now working against you in an entirely practical and unglamorous way. And the floor itself. Before any ball, the ballroom floor was prepared with care. First waxed to a high reflective shine, buffed until it returned the candlelight, then chalked, elaborate decorative patterns drawn directly onto the polished wood with chalk, geometric designs, floral motifs, sometimes the family's initials or crest. At the beginning of an evening, in the candlelight, the chalked floor was a kind of art, delicate and specific and clearly intended to be noticed. By the end of the evening, enough feet had danced across it that the patterns were worn entirely away, ground to dust under the continuous collective motion of the dancing. The floor that had been art at 9 o'clock was simply smooth, warm, well-worn wood by 2 in the morning. You stood at the edge of it and looked at the room around you. Your mother was beside you for the moment. She would not be beside you for long. She would find her position, the chairs along the wall, the particular vantage point she'd probably identified in advance, and she would settle into the watch. And from that moment on, the evening was yours. Yours to navigate, yours to perform in, yours to succeed or fail in, with all the consequences that attended both outcomes. Let us be very clear about what the word chaperone meant in practice. In the Regency era, a young unmarried woman of any social standing was not permitted to attend a ball unaccompanied, not casually unaccompanied, not simply the case of arriving before the rest of the family. She required a chaperone, a married woman of appropriate social standing whose specific function was to accompany her throughout the entire evening, monitor her interactions, and maintain the standards of propriety that the ton required. This was almost always her mother. Occasionally it was an aunt, or an older married sister, or a family friend of suitable status. But most often, in most families, for most young women, it was the mother. And the mother's role at a ball was fundamentally completely different from her daughter's. The daughter danced, the mother watched. This might sound like the easier assignment. It was not. The chaperones sat in chairs arranged specifically for them along the walls of the ballroom, positioned to give a clear and unobstructed view of the dance floor. From these chairs, the mother watched everything: who approached her daughter, who asked her to dance, how many times the same man returned to the floor with her, what could be read from across the room, in gestures, in the length of a conversation, in the particular way someone positioned themselves in relation to someone else, who looked at her daughter when they weren't dancing with her. Every detail about you, however small, was tracked. She also watched what didn't happen, which men didn't approach, which invitations didn't come, where the gaps were in her daughter's evening, and what those gaps might indicate about how the season was going overall. And while she watched her own daughter, she was also aware of being watched herself. Other mothers along the wall were making the same calculations about their own daughters. The collective social intelligence of the chairs along the wall was considerable, and it was being actively deployed even in apparent stillness. The women sitting in those chairs were not passive, they were working. The physical endurance required was not trivial. The woman in those chairs had probably spent the entire day managing a household before the evening began. Letters to write, calls to make, accounts to review, children younger than the one currently on the dance floor to manage, the household to run. And then the dressing, the carriage, the arrival, and now 4 or 5 hours in a hot room, watching a floor she could not rest from watching. Not once, not even briefly. Because missing a significant moment, a particular conversation that went on just a little longer than expected, an introduction that came from an unexpected direction, a gesture that needed to be evaluated for what it meant, would be a failure of her professional duty, and she was, in this context, functioning as a professional. One point of genuine relief arrived around midnight. Supper. Supper was a fixed point in the architecture of a Regency ball, typically served around midnight or sometimes as late as 1 in the morning, providing a substantial break from dancing. The food was actual food. A cold collation, meaning cold meats, pastries, ices, fruit, some wine. Enough to genuinely restore people who had been on their feet for hours. But supper was not merely a meal. It was a social event within the social event, and its strategic dimensions were taken seriously by everyone present. Who escorted whom to supper was observed and noted. A gentleman who offered his arm to a young woman and guided her through to the supper room was making a legible gesture of attention. Not as significant as asking her to dance, but visible. Supper seating was watched. Where people sat, who they sat near, whether a particular conversation at supper continued with greater warmth and engagement than the formal constraints of the dance floor had permitted. All of this fed into the ongoing intelligence the ton maintained about itself. The supper room was also one of the few spaces in a ball where people sat still and talked at length. Not while navigating a country dance, not while standing in a receiving line, but at rest, across a table, in something approaching an actual conversation. For a young woman hoping to advance a connection begun on the dance floor, supper was an opportunity. For a mother whose daughter had had a difficult first half of the evening, supper was a place to recalibrate and consider what the second half might still produce. Jane Austen moved through this world throughout her adult life, not as a young debutante, but as a woman who attended balls throughout her 20s and into her 30s, who watched from positions that were adjacent to but slightly outside the central drama of the marriage market, who recorded what she observed with a precision that her novels still carry 200 years later. Her letters to her sister Cassandra are among the most revealing primary sources we have for what the Regency ball actually felt like for a woman present in it. Not the formal social record, not the rules written down in conduct books, but the lived experience, reported privately, with the kind of frankness that intimacy allows and that official documentation never does. In one letter, written around 1800, Austen described attending a ball and dancing 9 of the 12 dances of the evening, and she noted, in a tone that is almost offhand, almost casual, that she had been merely prevented from dancing the rest by the want of a partner, merely prevented by the want of a partner. The phrase has a characteristic Austen quality, understatement so precise it cuts deeper than complaint. She sounds almost unconcerned. She makes it sound like a minor inconvenience, the kind of thing one notes briefly in a letter and then moves on from. But underneath the lightness, she was describing the fundamental and unglamorous arithmetic of the Regency ballroom. Too many women, not enough men. And once you understood that arithmetic, you could hear it in her phrasing, the careful understating of a thing that hurt. This was a recurring reality. Women came to balls in clusters, with their mothers, their sisters, their friends, their neighbours. Men had other options, their clubs, their private dinners, their various social spaces that did not include dancing. They were under no equivalent pressure to attend balls in equal numbers to the women who came, and sometimes they didn't, which meant that on some evenings, a perfectly eligible, perfectly gracious, perfectly accomplished young woman simply could not dance as much as she wanted to, not because of any failure on her part, not because she'd offended anyone, but because the numbers didn't balance. And if you happened to be that woman on that particular evening, the explanation was invisible to the room, while the consequence was not. Sitting in the chairs along the wall on those evenings, not from refusal, not from social failure, but from pure arithmetic, had its own quiet, particular demoralization. You'd done nothing wrong. The room just didn't have room for you tonight, and there was no way to explain that to the people watching who hadn't been paying close enough attention to understand the reason. Jane Austen attended many such evenings. She watched, she took note. She formed opinions, precise, and sometimes quite unsparing, about the system and the people inside it. She also, for the record, never married. In 1802, at the age of 26, she received a proposal from a man named Bigwither, the heir to a substantial country estate, a man whose fortune would have secured her material future entirely. She accepted that evening, reconsidered overnight, and withdrew her acceptance the following morning. She knew at 26 exactly what she was giving up: a household of her own, financial security, the position of a married woman in society, all of the stability that the system she had watched so carefully was designed to produce. She knew all of it with total clarity, because she was a woman who'd been paying very close attention, and if you had been in her position, with 26 years of watching this world, you would have known it too. She gave it back anyway. She wrote almost nothing for several years after that. The years between 1802 and roughly 1809 are sometimes called her silent period. Years in which the pen that would eventually produce Emma and Persuasion was largely still. Whether the refusal was connected to the silence is something biographers have speculated about for 2 centuries without resolution. We can't know. We can only observe that the two things happened in close succession. She lived with her family at Bath, at Southampton, eventually at Chawton in Hampshire, in the position of the dependent unmarried daughter, borrowed the writing table in the drawing room of the Chawton cottage, working around the household schedule, published her novels under the formulation by a lady, because her name alone was not quite enough of an identity to put on a title page in the early 19th century, needed the shelter of gender without the specificity of identity. She died in 1817. She was 41 years old. The women she had watched and thought about and written down in all those ballrooms across all those seasons are still here in her pages, more real than most historical records, their fears and their calculations, their small, brilliant acts of strategy inside a system that gave them almost no legitimate power, their mothers watching from the chairs, their victories modest and hard-won and rarely acknowledged at the time, their refusals, the costly ones, the brave ones, the ones that were mentioned in the morning calls the following day. And if you have read any Austen at all, you have met these women, even if you didn't realize at the time that what you were reading was history. There is a romantic version of the wallflower. You've probably encountered it. She stands at the edge of the room, a little apart from the dancing, watching everything with a quiet intelligence the room is too busy to recognize. She's not there because no one wants to dance with her. She's there because she is above all of this, perceptive where others are only performing, waiting, with patience and a kind of serene composure, for the one person in the room perceptive enough to find her. In the second act he does. This version is a gift from the retrospective imagination, a story that the 19th century novel developed and that every subsequent romantic narrative has refined and passed on. It is not the lived experience of sitting in those chairs during your own season, in your own white dress, while the music plays for other people. In the actual Regency ballroom, a young woman who spent the evening along the wall was not perceived as mysterious or elevated. She was perceived, by the room and by herself, as failing at the primary task for which she was there. The ball was a public event. Every aspect of it was visible. Who danced with whom, how often, in what configuration. A young woman who sat through most of the evening without dancing was telling the room a story she had no way to revise or dispute from where she was sitting. The story said one of two things. Either she'd been unable to attract partners, which implied something about her social network, her appearance, or her accomplishments, or she had been forced to refuse partners she found unsuitable, which meant she was sitting out by choice, a choice whose reasons were invisible to anyone who hadn't witnessed the specific refusal that had caused it, and there was nothing in the room's design that gave her space to explain herself. Your choices were visible, your reasons were not. The room didn't always know which story was true. It saw the result, a young woman in the chairs along the wall, and drew its own conclusions. Not cruelly, necessarily, not with malice. But the conclusion was drawn because the season was a market, and markets form their prices from visible information. Hostesses at private balls understood this sufficiently to feel an informal obligation to prevent it. A good hostess moved through the room, making introductions, directing eligible men toward unpartnered women, performing her own quiet version of the master of ceremonies role. The goal was to ensure that no young woman spent the evening entirely unseated, because a young woman sitting out entirely at your ball reflected on the quality of your guest list and the management of your evening. And yet it happened. Inevitably, in rooms where numbers didn't balance or where a refusal had closed off an evening, it happened. The chairs along the wall occupied a specific social position that everyone understood. They were the designated territory of the chaperones, the married women, the older women, the women who had completed their own seasons long ago, and whose place in the room was now to watch, rather than participate. For a young woman still in the middle of her season to be seated among them, to be in those chairs when she should be on the floor, was a displacement that everyone in the room recognized without needing to articulate it. You were in the wrong chairs, and the longer you sat there, the more visible it became. The sit-out rule, the rule that said if you refused one partner you forfeited the rest of the evening, was the mechanism that made this displacement most acute. It removed all agency from the situation after the initial refusal. You had made a decision, for reasons you probably considered entirely legitimate. This man was unsuitable, or unpleasant, or pressing in a way that made you uncomfortable. And having made that decision, the rest of the evening was no longer in your hands. You simply had to sit and endure and be seen sitting, and know that people were forming conclusions about what they were seeing. The gossip that followed a ball moved very quickly. By the morning after, people who hadn't been present could have a fairly accurate account of who had danced with whom, who had sat out, whether anything interesting had happened, and what various mothers were saying about it. The social intelligence of the ton was rapid, specific, and very broadly distributed. It had its own infrastructure, the morning calls, the private letters, the informal conversations at the next social event. Information in this world did not need newspapers. It had a better distribution system. A young woman who sat out at ball after ball across a season was building a reputation, whether she intended to or not. Not necessarily a catastrophic one. It was more gradual than that, more like erosion. Each season that passed without a successful match made her position slightly harder to present, her prospects slightly less discussed with enthusiasm, her name slightly less likely to come up when eligible young men were being considered. And if you were the one watching that erosion happen from the inside, feeling it in the quality of the invitations, in the slight change in how people spoke to you, the experience was one of very slow, very quiet diminishment. 2 failed seasons, the family still spending, the wardrobe renewed again, the mother still strategizing, still writing letters, still making introductions, still positioning, but with a growing tightness in her optimism that she tried not to let show. 3 seasons. The women who had come out at the same time as you, mostly married and gone, disappeared into married society, into households of their own, returning to the ballrooms now in the entirely different position of the young married woman, attending as a guest rather than a contestant, dancing because she wanted to, rather than because her future depended on it. 4 seasons, still here, still being introduced to men you've already met, still going through the motions of an enterprise that has, by this point, the quality of repetition rather than possibility. This is not comfortable to think about, and it was not comfortable to live through. And yet, here is the part of this history that tends to get lost in both the romantic and the tragic framings. Many women navigated this system with extraordinary skill. The ballroom was not simply something that happened to women. They were not passive recipients of the market's assessment. Within the very narrow constraints available to them, they exercised genuine agency, and some of them exercised it with a skill that was entirely real, even if it was never officially acknowledged. A young woman who was quick-witted on the dance floor, who could steer a conversation in a direction that showed her to advantage, who could make an impression in 20 minutes that a less skilled woman couldn't make in a full evening, was not just being assessed, she was shaping the assessment. The look held 1 second longer than strictly necessary as she moved past someone on the floor, the mention, in a passing exchange, of a shared interest she had identified in advance. The small, calibrated cooling towards someone she did not wish to encourage, done so subtly that only the person in question felt it. The way of entering a room that signalled ease without visibly trying to signal it. These were real skills, developed and practiced over many evenings in a context where they were your primary leverage. The Regency ballroom had almost no formal space for female agency, but in the unofficial, unacknowledged, uncredited space of social performance. In the 20 minutes of a country dance, in the seating at supper, in the careful management of who had access to your attention and for how long, real intelligence was being exercised, not always successfully, not by everyone, and not in conditions that made success easy, but by some women on some evenings, with a precision that deserved recognition then, and still deserves it now. The candles in the holders were burning lower, the wax pooling warm at the base, the flames sitting smaller than they had at the beginning of the evening. It was past midnight. The supper had been served and cleared. Some guests had already taken their leave. The room was quieter than it had been hours earlier. For some women the evening had been successful. There were things to think about on the carriage ride home, particular attentions to follow up, conversations to replay, reasons to be cautiously optimistic about what might develop from this evening toward the next one. For others, the drive home through the dark London streets had a different quality. Not despair, necessarily, but the particular flatness of an evening that had required everything and yielded nothing visible in return. And tomorrow, the morning calls would begin again. The morning calls began at noon. In Regency London, visiting between families of the ton followed a specific ritual. Between 12 and 3 in the afternoon, the fashionable world called on one another. Brief visits of 15 to 30 minutes in the formal receiving rooms of London townhouses. These were not casual. They were the primary mechanism through which the social intelligence of the ton circulated. The information exchanged in morning calls was the currency of the social network, the data that kept the whole system running and informed. And the morning after a ball, that currency was particularly rich. Who had attended? Who had danced with whom? How many times the same pair had danced? What had been observed in the supper room? Whether any particular conversation had gone on longer than strictly necessary? Whether a certain mother had looked pleased or not? Whether anything had been said or implied, or seemed to be quietly beginning? This was discussed systematically by everyone who had been there and everyone who wished they had been. The social memory of the ton was long, and it was specific. A woman who had watched an interesting moment on the dance floor at 11 o'clock the previous night could describe it accurately to 3 separate people by 2 o'clock the following afternoon. Those 3 people could convey it to 3 more by the following morning. Information in this world did not require newspapers or official channels. It had a distribution network of remarkable efficiency, entirely informal, entirely personal, and entirely reliable. A successful evening, one in which a young woman had danced well, attracted attention from eligible men, conducted herself with the right balance of warmth and composure, generated a particular quality of morning call conversation. Her name was mentioned, favourably, in context. And in the days that followed, she was watching carefully, trying not to appear to be watching too carefully, for the signs that something was developing, an invitation to drive in the park. Not conclusive on its own, but a data point. A call from the gentleman's mother, a considerably more significant signal. A second invitation to dance at the next ball, followed by a third at the one after that with the same man. That was a pattern, and patterns in the ton were read by everyone who observed them, with the same precision that the mothers in the chairs had applied to the dance floor. A formal courtship in the Regency did not begin with a declaration or any single dramatic moment. It began with a gradual increase in social attention, more visible presence, more consistent dancing, more deliberate positioning in the same rooms, the introduction of the gentleman's family, slow, deliberate, readable to anyone who knew the signs, which everyone did. The mothers in the chairs along the wall, those women who had watched every dance, noted every approach, tracked every pattern through the long hours of the previous evening, were the primary analysts of this accumulating information. They had been there, in the room, watching with full and continuous attention, and when something seemed to be developing, the mothers talked to each other, carefully, indirectly, in the particular social register of conversations that were heading somewhere without yet acknowledging where they were heading. The conversation between the mother of an eligible young man and the mother of an eligible young woman was a careful, indirect process that might proceed through several intermediate exchanges before arriving anywhere near the actual question. But it arrived, sometimes, when everything was in alignment. A formal offer, a proposal, was the outcome that the entire machinery of the season had been working toward. It arrived through the correct channels, a letter to the young woman's father, or a request for a meeting with him, followed by a formal conversation between the gentleman and the father, followed, if the father gave his approval, by the gentleman being permitted to speak directly to the young woman herself, and to hear her answer. Her answer was formally hers to give. The Regency was not without awareness that women had preferences, and that coercing a marriage without at least the outward form of consent was not quite the image the ton wished to project of itself. But the pressure on that answer, from the family's financial position, from the accumulated cost of the season, from the knowledge of what repeated refusals might eventually mean over multiple seasons, was real. It was real in ways that the formality of the process could obscure, but could not eliminate. There were women who said no regardless. Charlotte Lucas, in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, a fictional figure but drawn with the specificity of someone who had watched the real thing very carefully, accepts Mr. Collins not because she loves him, or even particularly likes him, but because she is 27 years old, not especially beautiful, not independently wealthy, and the alternatives she can see from where she stands are becoming considerably less appealing with each passing season. Austen presents this without judgment, because Austen understood what Charlotte understood. This was not a romantic calculation, this was an economic one, and Charlotte was making it with full awareness and making it correctly by the standards of her situation. Jane Austen, who watched all of this, who understood all of it, who wrote about it with more precision than almost anyone else of her era. In 1802, at the age of 26, she received a proposal from a man named Big Wither. She accepted him that evening. She withdrew her acceptance the following morning. She knew what she was giving up: a household of her own, financial security, freedom from the particular vulnerability of the dependent unmarried woman. She knew all of it at 26 as clearly as she had ever known anything, because she was a woman who paid very close attention to exactly these things. She gave it back. She wrote almost nothing for several years after that. She lived with her family in a series of houses, Bath, Southampton, Chawton, in the position of the dependent unmarried daughter, borrowing the writing table in the drawing room of the Chawton cottage, working around the household schedule. Published her novels under the formulation by a lady, because her name alone was not quite enough of an identity to put on a title page in the early 19th century. Needed the shelter of gender without the specificity of identity. She died in 1817. She was 41 years old, and the women she'd watched in all those ballrooms across all those seasons are still here in her pages, more real than most historical records, their fears and their calculations and their small, brilliant acts of strategy inside a system that gave them almost no legitimate power. Their mothers watching from the chairs, their victories, modest and hard-won and rarely acknowledged by anyone at the time. Their refusals, the costly ones, the brave ones, the ones that were mentioned in the morning calls the following day and discussed and eventually forgotten by everyone except the woman who had made them. Not everyone who attended a Regency ball was there under the same pressure. The young men in those rooms, the eligible ones, the ones whose attention was being sought and evaluated, occupied a fundamentally different position in the ballroom than the women across the floor from them. They were, in the language of the system, the ones who chose. And choosing, while it came with its own set of social obligations and expectations, did not carry the same existential weight that waiting to be chosen did. A young man of good family and adequate income approaching a Regency season had options. He could attend the balls or not as he preferred. He could participate in the marriage market on his own schedule. He was not facing the same narrowing window, the clock that started at 16 and ticked steadily toward a social unmarketability that had no male equivalent. A man of 30 who had not yet married was considered a confirmed bachelor, a figure of some amusement and mild social curiosity. A woman of 30 who had not yet married was something the ton's vocabulary was considerably less kind about. If you were a man in that room, the weight of the evening was a different kind of weight entirely. A man could also, in the Regency era, accumulate money. He could enter a profession. He could inherit, manage, invest. He had the basic infrastructure of independent economic existence in a way that women of the same class fundamentally did not, which means that his presence in the ballroom, while not without its own social choreography and expectation, was ultimately optional in a way that hers was not. This was a distinction so foundational to the world that it required no discussion. It was simply the shape of the world you'd been born into. This asymmetry was not something most people in the Regency discussed openly. It was too foundational to require discussion, like gravity or weather or the price of bread. It simply was. The system was built on it. The entire architecture of the season rested on it. But it is worth naming from where we're standing now, 200 years outside the room, because it changes how you read the ballroom as a social space. The men who were choosing freely within a system that had designed itself entirely around their freedom to do so. The women who were being chosen were performing a kind of freedom they did not have. And yet, within that performance there was genuine intelligence and genuine pleasure sometimes in the exercise of it. You have to hold both of those things at once to understand the Regency Ball honestly. It was a system designed against women's genuine freedom, and it was also a space where some women found real satisfaction in the skill of it, in the warmth of genuine connection within it, in the pleasure of dancing well and talking well, and navigating something difficult with grace. Neither the romantic version nor the purely grim version captures all of it. The music that played through all of this deserves its own attention. The orchestra at a Regency ball was not a small ensemble. A properly furnished private ball in a London townhouse might have 8 to 12 musicians, enough to fill a large room with sound and to sustain several hours of continuous playing with periodic short breaks. Public assembly rooms like Almack's employed larger orchestras. The music was live, always, because there was no alternative, no recordings, no mechanical reproduction. The only music was the music being made in the room by actual people, in the moment, for you. Which gave the evening a particular quality that is genuinely difficult to reconstruct now. The texture of music that is happening rather than playing. Music that has the presence of bodies behind it. The small variations that come from a live performance. A slightly different tempo when the musicians were tiring toward midnight. A warmth in the room that wasn't just about the candles but about the people making the sound and the people responding to it, all simultaneously in the same space. The primary repertoire for a Regency ball was country dancing. But the Regency was also the period in which the waltz arrived in England, and the arrival of the waltz was, by any measure, an event. The waltz came from the German-speaking world, where it had been popular for some time before it reached England in the early 1810s. And when it arrived, if you'd been watching the Tun's response with any attention, it caused something close to a moral emergency in the more conservative corners. The reason was simple: the hold. Country dances were performed in lines. Partners moved through sequences of steps beside each other, occasionally touching hands, occasionally passing close, but maintaining the separation that propriety required. At no point in a country dance did a man put his hand on a woman's waist and hold her there for the duration of the dance. The waltz did exactly this. A man and a woman faced each other. He placed his right hand on her back, on the actual physical body of a woman who was not his wife and who, in many cases, he had been formally acquainted with for only a few weeks. She placed her hand on his shoulder. They moved together in close rotation continuously for the duration of the dance. This was, to the sensibility of 1813 or 1814, shocking in a way that is genuinely hard to convey to a modern audience. The physical proximity was unprecedented in public social dancing. The sustained contact, the rotation, which brought their faces close together in a way that country dancing never had. The waltz required a kind of bodily trust between a man and a woman who were not married, that the entire social architecture of the Regency had been designed to prevent. Picture yourself in that position, in that room, in 1814, and you begin to understand why the waltz felt like something genuinely new had entered the world. Lord Byron, who was present for many of these early English waltz evenings, and who had opinions about most things, wrote a satirical poem about the dance in 1813. He was not enthusiastic. The poem's concern was specifically the physical contact and the implications he felt that contact carried for public morality. Whether his concern was genuine or theatrical is another question. Byron's moral opinions were always more interesting as literature than as guidance. But the waltz establishment at Almack's, the moment when the Lady Patronesses decided after some deliberation whether to permit the waltz at their Wednesday evening balls was a genuine social watershed moment, because what the patronesses decided the ton followed, and what the ton followed everyone adjusted their understanding of what was acceptable. The patronesses eventually permitted the waltz, with conditions. Not everyone was allowed to waltz. Specifically, a young woman who had recently come out was not immediately granted permission to waltz at Almack's. She needed to be approved by a patroness before she could take the floor for a waltz. The approval was given, when it was given, as a personal imprimatur. You were allowed to waltz because the Lady Patronesses had decided you were the kind of young woman who could be trusted to waltz. You can see, in this arrangement, the patronesses doing what they always did, taking a potential social disruption and routing it through their own system of approval, so that the disruption was managed and their authority over the room was confirmed rather than undermined. The waltz didn't circumvent the patronesses. The patronesses incorporated the waltz, which was, as social manoeuvres go, fairly elegant. For the young women who were permitted to waltz, the experience was qualitatively different from anything the country dance offered. The rotation, the sustained hold, the fact that for the duration of a waltz you were in physical contact with one person, this specific man, not a general group of partners moving through a set figure for an extended period. In a world where physical contact of any unsupervised kind between unmarried men and women was genuinely unusual, a waltz was not nothing. Some women found it extraordinary. Some found it uncomfortable, or found the proximity with a particular partner uncomfortable in ways they couldn't fully articulate within the social forms available to them. Others found it simply another layer of skill to master, one more thing to do well, one more way to be evaluated, and one more arena where composure and grace were non-negotiable. The waltz, in other words, landed differently for different people, as most things do. The Regency season was primarily a London affair, but it was not exclusively one, and the experience of the marriage market in the provinces, in the spa towns, in the county assembly rooms, in the smaller social worlds that existed at some distance from the specific gravity of Mayfair, was different from the London version in ways that are worth understanding. Bath, in particular, had its own social season, its own assembly rooms, its own version of the market. The Bath assembly rooms, the upper rooms and the lower rooms, were well-established venues by the Regency period, and they drew both the genuinely fashionable and those who were adjacent to fashion but couldn't quite sustain a full London season. Bath had its own master of ceremonies, its own rules, its own social hierarchy. But the fundamental machinery was the same: dances, introductions, observation, assessment. Jane Austen knew Bath well. Her family moved there in 1801, and she lived in the city for several years. Her novels returned to Bath repeatedly, and not always fondly. There is a quality to her treatment of Bath's social life, in Northanger Abbey and in Persuasion, that suggests someone who observed the provincial version of the marriage market with the same precision she brought to its London counterpart, but with an additional note of something that is not quite affection. Bath attracted a particular social mix that London season did not. Older residents, families whose health required the waters, military officers at half pay, living economically in a city where a modest income still permitted a reasonable social life, widows with independent means, younger sons, and young women and their families who either could not afford London or had found London insufficient and were trying the provincial alternative. If your family couldn't sustain a full London season, Bath was where your season might still be possible. The social calculations in Bath were the same, underneath it all, the stakes were the same, the anxiety was the same. The mothers in the chairs along the walls of the upper rooms watched with the same professional attention as their London counterparts. But the pool was different, the faces were different, and the particular flavour of hope that a young woman might bring to her first evening at the bath. Assembly rooms had its own specific texture, a little less certain, perhaps, than the girl stepping into Almack's for the first time, but no less real. Outside Bath, in the county towns, in the assembly rooms of market towns across England, there were balls of a considerably more modest kind, local gatherings, the same basic structure, music, dancing, chaperones, introductions, the careful social negotiation of who danced with whom and what it meant, but with a narrower pool of potential partners, a more intimate social world where everyone knew everyone's business already, and where the stakes, while lower in the sense that the ton was not specifically watching, were in other ways higher, because in a small county community, your reputation was not distributed across a vast metropolitan social network. It was local, concentrated, and it lasted. A young woman in a market town had fewer opportunities, which meant fewer chances to recover from a misstep, fewer balls across which to make her name, and a smaller group of eligible young men from whom a suitable match needed to be found. The narrowness of that world could be suffocating in ways that even the high-pressure London season did not quite replicate. In London, there are always more people. Another ball next week. A different room with different faces. In a small county there was just this, these people, this season, and next year, largely the same. It is worth pausing somewhere in the middle of all this information to consider what a young woman in any of these worlds was actually being asked to carry. She was being asked to be the primary agent of a family strategy that had been designed entirely around her, but without giving her the authority to direct it. She was being trained for years in accomplishments, music, drawing, needlework, languages, dancing, that were specifically designed to make her attractive in the marriage market, and that had essentially no value outside it. She was being evaluated continuously and publicly, on criteria that were never stated aloud. She was expected to perform ease and warmth and composure while managing a system of rules complex enough to trip anyone. And she was doing all of this, in most cases, from the age of 16 or 17. When you place all of those requirements alongside each other, you begin to understand why the ballroom could feel so heavy. There were 20-year-old women navigating Almack's who had more social and strategic intelligence than most adults twice their age, who understood the ton's rules better than the men who moved through those rooms with considerably more freedom, who could read a room, who was watching whom, where the alignments were shifting, what the significant conversations were, with a speed and accuracy that was genuinely remarkable. They were never called remarkable for it. That skill set was simply expected. It was the baseline. A girl who could navigate the ton social machinery without incident was not praised for doing so. She had merely met the requirement. The praise, such as it was, went to the additional accomplishments, the beautiful singing voice, the elegant needlework, the French spoken without accent. The social intelligence was assumed, like the ability to walk or to hold a fork correctly. It was the foundation, not the achievement, and yet it was an achievement by any honest measure. The aftermath of a successful season, a genuine, solid engagement, brought its own particular kind of relief, and its own new set of negotiations that the ball had set in motion but by no means completed. An engagement in the Regency era was a serious matter before the wedding ceremony itself took place. The formal agreement between the two families, negotiated primarily between the two fathers, with the involvement of lawyers on both sides in the case of any significant property, was called a marriage settlement. It was a legal document. It set out what each family was contributing to the new household, what the bride's portion was, how the husband's estate would be managed in relation to the wife's financial interests, and, critically, what provision was made for the wife if the husband died first. If your family was in a strong negotiating position, the settlement could be quite generous. If it wasn't, you took what was offered and hoped for the best. This last provision was called pin money, or more formally the widow's portion. It was the financial guarantee that a woman would not be left destitute if her husband died before her. A settlement that provided well for the widow was considered a mark of genuine good faith on the husband's family's part. A settlement that provided poorly, or that made the wife's financial security too contingent on the good behaviour of adult children she hadn't yet had, was something the bride's family would negotiate hard to improve. The entire arc of your social season, all those balls, all that careful dancing, it came down to this, a legal document, negotiated by fathers and lawyers in a room you were not in. These negotiations could take weeks. The engagement was announced. The couple was acknowledged publicly, permitted to walk in the park together with a reduced chaperonage requirement, permitted more social contact than the season's rules had allowed. But behind that social ease, the lawyers were writing documents, and the mothers were reading those documents very carefully, because the settlement would determine the material reality of their daughter's life in ways that the ball and the dance and the waltz had set in motion but never directly addressed. It is perhaps the most revealing aspect of the whole system, that the social ritual of the season, all that candlelight, all those rules, all those carefully managed dances, ended not in a romantic declaration, but in a legal document. That the marriage which had been choreographed through waltz approvals and supper seating, and the management of refusals was ultimately ratified by lawyers, with reference to property and income, and the financial provision for widowhood. The arc from the first ball to the signed settlement contained everything. The shimmer of the dance floor at the beginning, and the precise, careful language of property law at the end. A journey measured in silk and legal precedent, from the candles to the signatures. For the young woman who had navigated all of it, who had attended the balls, managed the rules, submitted to the evaluation, caught the right attention, survived the morning calls, maintained the performance through all those exhausting evenings. The settlement represented something, a kind of completion. Whatever the season had been designed to do, it had done. The bet had paid off. What came after the wedding was a different life, a household to manage, a position in society that was genuinely her own, however constrained, the beginning of something that was, at its best, a real partnership between two people who had found each other in a room full of candles and assessment and rules. There are letters from women of the Regency period writing to sisters or friends after their first year of marriage. Some are genuinely warm. They found contentment, found a kind of companionship, found that the man they had assessed in 20 minutes on a dance floor had turned out, against the odds of the whole strange system, to be someone worth marrying, someone patient and kind and genuinely interested in them as a person, not just as a wife in the institutional sense. Some letters are not warm, they are careful, in the particular way that letters from this period tend to be careful, written with the knowledge that correspondence might be read, that certain things could not be said directly, that the social obligation to present a version of contentment was as real in marriage as it had been on the dance floor. But behind the careful tone, there is sometimes a quality of resignation that is unmistakable. A woman writing to her sister about the management of the household and the social obligations of her new position, and describing it all with a thoroughness that leaves no room for anything else. Nothing about happiness, nothing about her husband by name, or with warmth, or in any way that suggests he is a person to her rather than a set of practical circumstances. And if you read enough of those letters, you begin to notice the absence, the things that aren't said, and why. Those letters are harder to read than the obvious unhappy ones. The obvious ones at least say something directly. The careful ones just describe the household, over and over, with impeccable thoroughness. Jane Austen read both kinds of letters. She wrote both kinds of letters, and she turned all of it into fiction that is still being read 2 centuries later, which is its own kind of testimony to what a careful observer can do with a world that offers her almost no formal power and a great deal of material to work with. There is a particular fact about the Regency marriage market that tends to get lost in all the discussion of rules and vouchers and refusals. It is a fact about time. The average length of a Regency season, the active social period during which balls occurred with a frequency and social weight that made them the market they were, was approximately 5 to 6 months, from January through June, with the most intensive ball-going concentrated in the spring months. And within that season, the major balls, the ones that actually moved the social needle, numbered perhaps 20 to 30, concentrated into a period of perhaps 12 weeks. 12 weeks, in which to meet, assess, be assessed, dance with, talk to, impress, consider, be considered, and reach the beginning of something that might become a marriage settlement. 12 weeks in which your entire future was, in the most practical sense, up for determination. 12 weeks in which all of the preparation of the preceding years was expected to produce a tangible result, or be attempted again next year with somewhat fewer options and a somewhat larger expenditure already behind the family. 12 weeks is not a long time. It is long enough to meet someone at a ball, dance with them twice, talk to them at supper, meet them again at the next 3 balls, receive an invitation to drive in the park, and begin the process of understanding whether the person you are sitting across from in a carriage is someone you could spend your life with. Long enough, if everything went right. Not long enough, if it didn't. Not long enough necessarily to find out what you actually needed to find out before committing to something permanent. But the system was not designed to give you time. It was designed to produce matches in the available window before the investment ran out and the options narrowed. The window was real. Your time in it was limited, and everyone in the room with you understood that, even if no one said it aloud. The wonder in retrospect is not that the system produced some unhappy marriages. The wonder is that it sometimes produced genuinely good ones. That 2 people, navigating a dance floor under those conditions, occasionally managed to find something real in each other. That the artifice of the whole enterprise sometimes produced an entirely authentic human connection, in spite of everything the system was asking of them. That is perhaps the most human part of this story. Not the rules, not the vouchers, not the refusal gamble or the sit-out consequence or the 3 baskets on the table covered in red cloth. But the fact that inside all of those structures, inside all of that machinery of evaluation and performance and social management, actual people were present. Young women who were afraid and brave and clever and sometimes funny and sometimes lonely. Young men who were, in their various ways, also navigating something they hadn't designed. Mothers who were devoted beyond what was ever acknowledged. And occasionally, not always, not even often, but occasionally, two people across a dance floor who actually found each other, who sat at supper and talked, and discovered that the person across the table was someone your whole future might reasonably, genuinely include. That deserves to be said, not sentimentally, but honestly. The Regency Ball was a terrifying institution for young women, and it was also sometimes the room where something began that mattered. Both things can be true, and holding both of them, without resolving them into a simpler story, is probably the closest you can get to understanding what it actually was. What your own version of any complicated system actually is, when you look at it honestly from both directions at once. The candles in the holders were burning lower, the wax pooling warm at the base, the flames sitting smaller than they had at the beginning of the evening. It was past midnight. The chalked patterns on the floor had been danced entirely away. The room was quieter than it had been hours before, and the season for tonight was almost done. And here is what I want to leave you with, before the evening grows quiet. The Regency Ball is over. It's been over for 200 years. The season, as a social institution of that particular weight and consequence, is gone. The Lady Patronesses of Almack are gone. The 3-basket voucher system is gone. The rule about refusing a dance and sitting out the rest of the night is gone. But the experience underneath those rules, the experience of being assessed in public on criteria you didn't set, in ways you can't fully control, that experience is not gone. You know that room. You've been in your version of it. Some room where performing ease is its own exhausting labour, where the gap between who you are and who you're presenting yourself as feels very wide, where the whole evening requires you to hold something carefully together without anyone seeing the effort it takes. That recognition, across 2 centuries, across all the distance of circumstance and context, is why this particular piece of history still holds something. Not because the Regency Ball was tragic, though it sometimes was, but because the people inside it were real people, doing the best they could inside a system they didn't design, with the tools available to them which were fewer than they deserved. The morning calls would begin again at noon, and the season would go on. Think about what the Regency Ball actually was, at its core. Strip away the gowns and the candlelight, the music and the architecture of rules, the patronesses and the 3 baskets and the table covered in red cloth. Strip all of that away, and what remains underneath it all is simply people. Young women who were afraid. Young women who were brave. Mothers who were exhausted and devoted and could not afford to let those 2 things show at the same time. A system that was inadequate to the people inside it, as systems almost always are. The fear was real, and so was the pleasure, in moments, the pleasure of dancing well, the warmth of a genuine conversation on the floor, the small private satisfaction of a gown that turned out to be exactly right. Human beings find joy, even in difficult situations, especially shared ones. That has always been true, and the Regency Ballroom was no exception to it. But the weight was also real. The weight of being watched. The weight of knowing your future was somehow present in the room with you, attending the same ball, and that the decisions made tonight, the right dance, the wrong refusal, the moment that either landed or didn't, were accumulating towards something, whether you wanted them to or not. These were not unique fears. That is the thing that stays with you if you sit with this history long enough. The specific circumstances have changed completely. The Regency Ball as an institution is gone, but the experience of performing in a room that evaluates you, that is not gone. You know that room. You've been in your version of it, in whatever shape your own time and world has given it, and tonight you are not in it. Tonight, whatever room you face today, you've faced it already. It's behind you now. The performance of the day, whatever form it took, whatever it cost you, is over. The things that were asked of you have already happened. You've done them or you haven't, and either way the evening is closed. The carriage has gone home. You're here. The day is behind you. The night is wide and slow and yours. Let the weight of your body settle into wherever you are. The mattress, the cushions, whatever is holding you right now. Solid. Patient. Asking nothing of you. Your hands can stop. Your shoulders can drop without anyone watching whether they drop correctly. There is no performance required here. There is no one in this room evaluating your expression. The day is done. The night asks nothing. In a drawing room in London 200 years ago, the candles were burning lower. The ball was in its final hours. The chalked patterns on the floor had been danced entirely away, ground to nothing by hours of feet moving across them. The music had slowed. The musicians were tired, and you could hear it in the slightly different weight of the notes, the small effort behind what had seemed effortless 3 hours earlier. Some guests had taken their leave. The room was quieter than it had been. The candles were burning very low. The wax had pooled in the holders, warm and settled, the flames sitting small above it, casting light that was softer and more golden than the brilliant illumination of the evening's beginning. The shadows on the walls were warm and still. The floor had lost its chalk patterns entirely. It's just smooth, warm wood, warm from the dancing. Near one of the windows a young woman was standing, looking out at the London street below. The city was mostly asleep. The street was dark and quiet. The music behind her was almost done. She was tired, not just physically, though her feet ached and her shoulders ached, and there was the particular tiredness of having danced in a warm room for several hours. She was tired in the deeper way that performance always exhausts. That specific fatigue of having maintained a surface for hours, of having been looked at and assessed and looked at again, of having held herself exactly right through an entire long evening, knowing that inattention could matter. The candles were almost out. The light was low and warm and still. Somewhere in your chest a breath is moving slowly in and out. It has been doing this through all of it, through the noise, the attention, the navigation of the whole long day. It was there the whole time, steady beneath everything else. It's here now. The candles in the room are very nearly at their end. The wax has cooled and pooled in the holders, the flames low and steady and warm, the light they cast the gentlest kind. The kind that comes near the end of a long evening, when the room has settled, when everything that was going to happen has happened, when it is almost time to go. The flame is very small now. The light is warm and low and soft. The corridor is quiet. The last carriage is already gone. The woman who stood near the window, the one who spent the evening holding herself exactly right, who danced when she was asked and smiled when she needed to, and sat when the rules required and navigated all of it as well as she could with the tools she had. She's gone home now, into the ordinary dark of the London night. Her dress hangs on its hook. The feathers are put away. The evening has closed over her the way evenings do, completely, without ceremony, and somehow gently. And tonight, so have you.